Welcome back to Talking Foreign Affairs, a show where we interview some of the biggest names in foreign affairs and diplomacy. I'm your host, Adil Kader. Joining us today, we are delighted to have someone who has not only witnessed history, but recently written a first-hand account of it, Lord Chris Patten, who served as the last governor of Hong Kong. We'll be talking about Lord Patten's time as governor and also his reflections on the current situation in Hong Kong. As this episode is being recorded, Lord Patten is currently touring Australia as a speaker for the ANU Chancellor's Oration. He also recently released a book called the Hong Kong Diaries. Lord Chris Patten started his career as a British Member of Parliament, going on to serve as Environment and Overseas Development Secretary. He was then appointed as the last governor of Hong Kong, serving from 1992 to 1997, overseeing the final years of British control and the transfer to China. He currently also serves as the Chancellor at the University of Oxford. Lord Patten, thank you so much for joining us.
Delighted to be here.
Thank you. Lord Patten, it's been over 25 years since the handover of Hong Kong. Please take us back to the night of midnight 1st of July 1997. What was going through your mind and what were some of your emotions?
Well, I suppose there were two emotions principally. The first was that I was leaving a city with my family that we'd all loved. It was one of the happiest periods of my life. I had so many friends there. So it was a bit of a wrench. Secondly, I guess I also had a sense that for a lot of people, this wasn't just the end of Britain's colonial responsibilities, but the end of a whole era for Europe and colonial powers. And I suppose added to that, I had a certain nervousness about whether what the Chinese Communist Party had offered, one country, two systems, was actually going to work. And there were plenty of people whom I admired who thought it was oxymoronic to talk about a free society under the rule of law as part of communist China. One of the people who was very doubtful about whether things would continue to be free in Hong Kong was one of my, I suppose, main intellectual gurus, who was a Belgian Australian called Pierre Reitman, who was a professor at ANU, then a professor at Sydney, who wrote under the nom de plume Simon Leeds, and among other things, wrote I think the best translation of the Confucian Analects and a brilliant introduction to them. So for him and for some other people, whether an economist like Milton Friedman or others who were more expert in how impossible it was apparently for a Chinese Communist Party to reform, others were rather doubtful about whatever we did, whether it would survive. And the wonder is, in some respects, that it survived as long as it did.
So you speak about your wariness and how hesitant you were, but also in your book, you talk about that there was initial optimism and then fear about whether China would keep its promise of the one country, two systems policy. What was the general mood among the people of Hong Kong in regards to China's promise?
Well, I think that it had been greatly affected, as far as a lot of people were concerned, by the killings in Tiananmen in 1989, when Hong Kong had provided a refuge for a lot of people, had tried to support the demonstrators in Tiananmen, and had then seen them obliterated, and the attempts by the Chinese Communist Party to snowpake out, to get rid of that aspect of its history. And you have to remember something that made people in Hong Kong pretty leery, pretty dubious about life under the Chinese Communist Party. Most of them were refugees from Chinese communism, who had left because of the Great Leap Forward or the Great Famine, which probably killed maybe as many as 4 million people, or the Cultural Revolution, people who had clambered over razor wire, stowed away in a ship like Jimmy Lai when he was a kid, swum through dangerous waters in order to get to a British colony, which was a terrible blow for, I guess, the Chinese Communist Party, who thought that the definition of a patriot was somebody who loved communism. And there was no reason why the majority of people in Hong Kong should be keen on communism. So when I began writing the diaries, which is the first time in my life I've ever kept a diary, but I thought this is going to be a very special 5 years. When I started writing my diaries, I was aware of that sort of background of nervousness about the future. When I actually left Hong Kong, talking to one of my advisors in the city, he said, surely, if they were simply going to walk away from everything we've agreed with them, they wouldn't have spent so much time negotiating the crossed T's and dotted I's about the arrangements for the handover. So there was a sort of mix of emotions, but I think there was a sort of uneasy feeling in much of Hong Kong about what would actually happen.
And 26 years later, did you ever envisage it would be in the situation that it is now?
Well, the situation as it is now is, I think, a vengeful and fairly comprehensive assault by the Chinese Communist Party on all the freedoms you associate with an open society. When I was in Hong Kong, people used to sometimes say, well, you can't expect, you wouldn't expect the Chinese to slaughter Hong Kong because it's the goose that lays the golden egg. I never thought that was a very persuasive argument because China was getting bigger steadily. And even though when we left, the Hong Kong economy was about 18% of China. But I did always think that there was a different avian metaphor, which perhaps would tell us a lot about the future. And that was the metaphor about the canary down the mine, that when the canary stopped singing, you knew that there was no oxygen and that perhaps things were being destroyed. And I always thought that the way the Chinese Communist Party treated Hong Kong would give the world some indication of how China would behave under communist rule towards other countries. And I think it's made over the years people very cautious, because while for maybe 10 or 15 years after 1997, things in Hong Kong didn't go too badly wrong. There was more interference than Beijing than had been promised. And Beijing went back on the promises that had made about allowing democracy to develop slowly but steadily. While that happened, nevertheless, Hong Kong was still observably the same place. People weren't being locked up because of their views. Newspapers and media organizations weren't being closed down because they were thought to represent a threat. And it's always seemed to me that one of the problems with Xi Jinping was that he recognized that the sort of aspects of an open society represented by Hong Kong were an existential threat to the control of the Chinese Communist Party over the country. And I think that when he became leader in China, he was nervous about a sense that control was slipping away steadily, and that, like other authoritarian states, a point made by de Tocqueville about the French Revolution, authoritarian states are always at their most vulnerable when they try to reform, when they try to change. So I think that from Xi Jinping onwards, any idea that Hong Kong was going to be left alone as a free society was trashed.
A very interesting point, and you mentioned about President Xi's coming in 2013 and reforming it more to a sense of Maoism, authoritarianism. And I want to pick up something you said in your recent speech at the ANU, where you said, quote, for many years under the collective leaderships of Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, China seemed to be open up politically as well as economically. No one sensible thought it was en route to an early embrace of parliamentary democracy, the separation of powers, and the rule of law. But it did seem that party control weighted less heavily on all aspects of society. Now, what you also do say is that it was President Xi who was mainly responsible, correct me if I'm wrong, that for the return to authoritarianism and Maoism. However, there is also a school of thought that this has been brewing up for a while, that President Hu was also responsible for providing platforms for President Xi's policies. Some of these examples include President Hu presiding over internal changes to the CCP, switching from pro-entrepreneurial policies to one of mass subsidies, developing a precursor to the Belt and Road initiatives, the new historic missions, naval facilities throughout the Indian Oceans, directing China's military and diplomats to launch a full-court press in Southeast Asia, and advancements in the Scarborough Shoal. The question being, do you think it's purely President Xi, or was there some build-up during the Hu Jintao era?
I think it's mainly President Xi, if we must call him president. And if you think back of just a few weeks or months to what President Xi Jinping said at the beginning of the 20th Party Congress about his predecessor, about Hu Jintao, I think it's perfectly clear that Xi Jinping thought there should be a caesura, a break between Hu's period and his own. It's probably true that some changes were in the offing, but what I think defined what Xi Jinping was going to be up to internationally and indeed domestically was set out in what's called, in a sort of Orwellian phrase, Communique number 9, which was actually issued, I think, under his leadership, not when he actually become president. Before that, I think he chaired the committee which actually produced the Communique number 9, which urges the party cadres and government cadres to engage, and the phrase used in Chinese translates as an intense struggle. And then they list the sort of aspects of an open society which you and I would take for granted, whether freedom of speech or freedom of assembly or freedom of inquiry at universities, the separation of powers, which you mentioned, all those things are set out as things against which the Chinese party, Communist Party, should be engaged in an intense struggle. So I think things did change then. And there were, of course, a number of Western leaders who deluded themselves about what was happening. Our own Prime Minister at the time, Tony Blair, described, after the Chinese had entered the WTO, and when I was a European Commissioner, I'd helped, as far as the Europeans were concerned, to negotiate this. When they joined the WTO, Tony Blair said that China's route to democracy was now unstoppable. Well, there was quite a lot of that sort of delusion around. And I don't know if you've read the wonderful histories of modern China by Frank de Cotter, or what the person I mentioned earlier, Simon Lees, has written about China. And de Cotter and Lees would, I think, regard it is literally impossible for the Chinese Communist Party to engage in serious economic and political reform. And I think that was brought home by Xi Jinping. But I certainly think when you look back, life was certainly rather more relaxed and open under Jiang Zemin and Wen Jiabao and Zhu Rongji and so on in those years. And what we've seen come back is the cult of personality, a sort of worshipping of Mao, who was a mass murderer. And also, I think, a sense that you're vulnerable, you're weak as a Communist Party if you ever allow difference of view to flourish anywhere. So if you remember the very brave dentist who died early on in the coronavirus, who was trying to blow the whistle on what was happening, said memorably, I think he was quoting others, that it was, you couldn't have a really happy society or successful one if there was any one voice. But I think that's, I'm afraid, rather different from what Xi Jinping thinks.
So you mentioned about Prime Minister Blair and the optimism he had for China becoming a democracy. Obviously, that vision has gone wildly off track based on recent records. But on the notes of democracy, how should liberal democracies like Australia and the US that maintain close economic ties with China also do so while maintaining the democratic ideals?
So my own view has always been that while we should not try to contain China, we should constrain China when it behaves badly. When it behaves badly over breaking its word over the militarization of the South China Sea, for example, when it behaved badly over Tibet and Hong Kong and Xinjiang and so on, we should call that sort of behavior out. But when it behaved badly in relation to breaching its word to Hong Kong, we should call it out. When it behaved, in my view, badly in relation to the international health regulations, which had first been agreed not least by China after 2006 and the SARS outbreak. Then, if China had done what it promised to do at that stage, at the very least, we'd have known more about what caused the outbreak of coronavirus, and we would have dealt with it, been able to deal with it more rapidly. So I think there have to be consequences when China behaves badly. But of course, if you want to deal with climate change, then you have to recognize that 1.3, 1.4 billion people are going to have a very large part of the narrative in that. What I don't think we should accept is China's refusal to accept reciprocity as the basis for international trade or international investment. And the way China tries to bully countries, including Australia, but not very successfully, whenever anybody says anything that they dislike, or when they do things that are disliked, by threatening the exports of this or that country, whether Australia or Canada or the United Kingdom or Norway or South Korea, and when that happens, I think we have to recognize two things. First of all, we have to call it out, and if it's in breach of the WTO rules, say that, but also just make it clear that we're, as liberal democracies, prepared to stand up with one another against that sort of behavior. I think we also need to do what's been very well done in Australia, which is to examine what actually happens. Because by and large, Australian trade with China, despite all that huffing and puffing, went up in the years after Australia had been threatened with being put in the doghouse by China. And there were one or two areas, not least, perhaps very relevant in Western Australia. There were one or two sectors like the wine business, which did do badly. Though it produces sufficiently good products that it's managed to fill markets. But we shouldn't be cowed by the Chinese using those sort of economic games into doing exactly what they want us to do. The idea that if you meet as a leader, even as a spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, you're justifying the Chinese stopping buying products from you, it's absurd. We wouldn't accept that behavior from anybody else. So we should stop, we should junk the idea of Chinese exceptionalism. China is a great country with a great civilization, but it's not totally unlike everybody else has ever been.
So on that note about taking action, I know you've consistently stated you're against Hong Kong independence. Would anything change your mind? And also on that note, whether it's Taiwan or Hong Kong, how should other countries react specifically? Is there a limit? I know a good friend and colleague of yours, Gareth Evans, who was very instrumental in the R2P doctrine and campaign. Will there be a time, and should there be a time when the international community should apply R2P to Hong Kong?
Well, I always opposed the movement, which wasn't very large, in Hong Kong for independence on two grounds. First of all, I thought it played into the hands of the hardliners in the Communist Party, who would equate the pressure for great democracy or for protecting human rights in Hong Kong as a surrogate for independence, which wasn't true. I also thought it would be dishonorable of me to do that because I've been party to arrangements which go back 99 years, which meant that Hong Kong was never going to become independent, unlike Singapore or Malaysia or other of our former colonial responsibilities. I do think that, however, what has been happening is that the Chinese have been presiding over Hong Kong without Hong Kongers. If you think about the number of Hong Kongers who have gone into exile in Britain, in Canada, in Australia, they're not people who hate Hong Kong. They're people who hate the idea of Hong Kong having the life squeezed out of it by communist China. And Hong Kong has been turned into literally a police state run by some policemen who've got blood on their hands. And not least, for example, the security secretary who was I think, responsible for policing in a part of Hong Kong where the triads were let loose on demonstrators, with the police standing by. His reward for that is to become head of security. The present chief executive was a policeman who made his reputation by taking a very tough line on demonstrations in Hong Kong. So my own view is that the Chinese are doing the very reverse of what would be required to earn the loyalty and support of people in Hong Kong.
We'll just now move on to questions submitted in by listeners. The first is, you talk about having to compete against British diplomats in Hong Kong and also businesses, and whether they had the best interest at heart for Hong Kong. Looking at the other side of the coin, was there any benefits from close ties with China? And could you see where they were coming from?
Well, on the whole, British diplomats were very supportive. There were one or two who weren't. And I inherited the criticisms of the former guru on matters Chinese in Britain, who was a diplomat called Percy Craddock, who once said to me, as he said to other people, what you've got to understand is that the Chinese leadership may be thuggish dictators, but they're men of their word. Well, we certainly had the first of those judgments confirmed, but men of their word, they were certainly not. What I always resented in Hong Kong was criticism from people who wanted to have or did have a British passport in their back pocket, just in case things went badly wrong, but were very critical of any attempt to secure the future, a free future for the people who worked for them. I always thought that was pretty outrageous. As for the benefits of doing whatever China wanted, look, I've set out the figures for this on a number of occasions. In the years before I became governor, we had allegedly very good, warm, close relations with China. When I was governor, we had a number of arguments because I was trying to stand up for people in Hong Kong. In the periods before I became governor, our exports to China and investment in China fell. In the years when I was governor, allegedly having all these arguments with China, our exports were going up. So nobody could say that my behavior or the politics changed the fact that the Chinese buy the things they want at the best price they can get. So they behave in that sense like everybody else. So they make threats, but in practice, economics, profit and loss dictates its own terms.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And also in your book, you talk about the challenges and something I would find interesting, how you had to convince them and the arguments you had. But yeah, I'm pretty sure the listener that submitted in that question will be really grateful for that response. The next question we had is, was refusing to hand back Hong Kong at the end of the 99-year lease period ever an option that was considered by the British government?
No, it wasn't, because we feel bound or felt bound by an international treaty and by international law. So it was never an option, but it put us in a very difficult position politically and morally. Throughout Asia, colonial responsibilities had meant that we prepared countries for independence, like Singapore, like Malaysia. And we would establish a bicameral legislature, independent courts, due process, separation of powers. And one day we would put all this on the launch pad and fire the country off into outer space and hope it would go into orbit as an independent country. That was never possible in Hong Kong because it was always going back to Chinese sovereignty. And when sometimes back in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, the British government suggested that it might move faster on democracy, the Chinese leaders, including Zhou Enlai, said you're not to do this because if you do that, it will make people in Hong Kong think that Hong Kong is like every other British colony, it's going to become independent. It led to some extraordinary and worrying issues when I was governor of Hong Kong. I tell the story in my diaries about going to a mental hospital and being stopped by a very respectably dressed Chinese gentleman who asked me whether I would regard Britain as being the earliest parliamentary democracy. And I said, well, people said that. And he said to me, and would you regard China as the last great communist power in the world? So some people would argue that. So he said, well, could you tell me, he said, why it is that you're handing back the people of Hong Kong to a democracy, to the last great communist tyranny, without ever asking people what they think? And it was a perfectly valid argument, except that we could never have done it. But I did used to think that it was extraordinary that the man with the sanest question in Hong Kong was in a mental hospital.
Interesting point. And you mentioned about how typically for all the other colonies you prepare bicameral legislatures and how there were criticisms that Hong Kong shouldn't be like any other British colony. And that this tie into the fact, I know when you tried to implement the 1994 electoral reforms that you were met with a lot of criticism back then.
Yeah, I think part of the criticism was because I refused to accept that before we made any change in Hong Kong, we had to get agreement from the Communist Party in Beijing. And I also thought it was wrong to cut the people of Hong Kong out of the debate about their future. So trying to involve people, telling them what we would like to do, leaving it to the legislature to decide whether they would accept it or not, was regarded as intolerable by the Chinese Communist Party. They called it the three-legged stool. They thought everything should be resolved between China, the Communist Party, and the British government as the two sovereign powers. And they thought that that's why any attempt to involve people in Hong Kong was regarded as the three-legged stool. But I used to point out that two-legged stools fall over and collapse, so that it was perfectly sensible. It was an awful metaphor. It was perfectly sensible to try to involve people. So when we set out the Court of Final Appeal, when I arrived in Hong Kong, there was no agreement. It had been given a thumbs down by the legislature, and we said what we wanted to do, and eventually we negotiated a successful establishment of a substitute for the Privy Council when it came to appeals against legal decisions in Hong Kong. Whether that's working as well now as it should is another matter, but that was the intention.
And just finally, I was finishing off with our last question, a light-hearted question is, you mentioned in your stories about how Margaret Thatcher, out of all the leaders and officials who visited your residence, that Margaret Thatcher was the only leader who made their room in the morning. Do you have any other interesting stories of personal qualities you observed from leaders who visited the governor's residence?
Oh, all too many. And you'll have to read my diaries to see some of the references. But it was extraordinary how many people came to visit Hong Kong during the 5 years I was there. Margaret Thatcher and I had not always seen eye to eye in domestic politics, but in Hong Kong, she was a huge supporter of what we were trying to do. But I think I saw most of the leaders of Western democracies at that time. But as you said at the outset, it was Gareth Evans, then the foreign minister of this country, of Australia, who was probably the first to support publicly what we were trying to do. recognizing that it wasn't being provocative, but recognizing that it was a reflection of our concern, our mutual concern about human rights. And I can't understand there are occasionally people, even in this country, who argue that China is exceptional, that the Chinese view of human rights is understandably not the same as that for everybody else. But human nature is the same everywhere. So why do we assume that human rights are different? And how can anybody who's intelligent, unless they've got skin in the game, and not very attractive skin, possibly argue that what's happening in Xinjiang is other than appalling? How can they all argue that what's happened in Tibet has been anything other than appalling? So I'm very much in favor of people who are dealing with China who are realistic, but also trying to find a modus vivendi, a way of getting on, like your foreign minister, I think, has been doing it in an exemplary way. And to describe what she's been doing as not dramatic seems to me a reminder of the fact that it's a myth to think that that young people do rage and old people do wisdom. Alas, I don't think it's always true.
And I like how you mentioned about back then Foreign Minister Evans, because I know at the time the Prime Minister Paul Keating was actually against what you were doing, but it was Foreign Minister Evans who came out in support of your policies.
Yeah, I don't have any strong view about former prime ministers of any country. Well, I have strong views about some of the former prime ministers of mine, and I realise that sometimes former leaders, even Australians, find it difficult to be balanced in their assessments. But to say what Penny Wong is doing isn't diplomacy is, of course, a ridiculous slur.
Lord Patten, thank you so much for your time today and your insight. We really appreciate you coming on. We really appreciate the books you've done and the work you've done, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks.